Hi, welcome to White Davy Garden Worm Farm. Today we are going to be doing something different for our Q&A live. So you may notice that I have 3 containers here. So we're going to be doing an experiment. So in our experiment, we are going to be using 4 worms. So this container here says it has 2 worms, and these worms were mated on the 28th of January. In here we have, well, we don't have the worm in here yet, but these were mated yesterday around 2:50 p.m. and the same for this one. Just a minute, I just realized I forgot to bring the worms. Okay, they aren't too far away, thankfully. Hi, Han. Okay, I think I am in a bit of trouble here. Hi, Cece. Yes, I was trying to see the messages because my laptop is not very good for recording videos, so I'm using my phone because I don't know how to set up my camera to the laptop. I tried to download the app, but it wouldn't allow me to do so. So I have 2 worms in here that were mated. Now in each of these containers, I have cocoa coir, and I have compost and a hint of cornmeal and crushed eggshell. So that is what these bins are going to be fed. Now what is being fed to the bin is not what is important, but I'm just letting you know what I have in here. So we're going to go ahead and add the worms. 1 worm per container. This one already has the 2 worms in it. So the purpose of this experiment is more focusing on these 2 bins that has the single worms more than that one. So the purpose of this is, after mating, I want to see how these worms are going to perform. So if you will bear with me for just a minute, then I will switch the camera around, and then I can go into discussing the purpose of the experiment. Oh. Oh, I'm having trouble here. Okay, so I'll just keep it as is. So what I'm attempting to do here with these worms is to see how, after mating, how long it is going to take them to produce the cocoon. And in theory, and based on an experiment that I did in the past, it is said that these worms takes 3 weeks to lay their cocoons. Now there is something important that I want to figure out. When these worms mate, do they produce more than 1 cocoon from that one mating? That is something that I would really like to find out. And if so, how many cocoons are they really going to be producing? I am trying to see my chat to bring it up on the screen, but Yeah. So I want to know how many cocoons they're going to produce after one mating. And I also want to know, will they do well living on their own? And while they're living on their own, what size are these ones that are living on their own going to be in comparison to this one that has two worms? And if I put more worms in here, what will the size of these worms be compared to what is in here? So those are the things that I want to figure out. And after I figured out those things, I'm going to be keeping these worms in here for a really long time. In fact, I don't know when I'm going to end this experiment, but what I'm going to be doing is giving you guys constant update on what is going on with these worms. So we'll be searching for the cocoons incrementally. So at the 3 weeks period, or maybe a little bit under 3 weeks, we'll be searching for cocoons. And in addition to that, I want to see how long these worms can actually live. So after I have completed the experiment where I get to see how many cocoons they're going to lay after mating, then I'm going to be combining these two together, and then they're just going to be raised together, and then we're going to keep them for as long as possible to actually determine how long they're going to live. Of course, it would be nicer if I was starting off with cocoons and allowing the cocoons to hatch. Then we'd be able to see how long worms do live, but from this point on, it would be interesting to see how long these worms will live. So what do you guys think? Do you like the experiment? Okay, if you guys will bear up with me, I'm just going to move these guys out of the way. I really do miss my laptop. It's kind of tricky working without it. Sorry about that. I'm really struggling here. I really have to get my webcam set up properly. Okay, let me just remove these gloves. I didn't want to come in. Oh my Lord, I am struggling today. I guess I should have spent more time planning this, but I was trying to figure out. I wanted to do the experiment. I wanted to do it as a video, but then I didn't really have a lot of time because of a project that I am working on. So I really wanted to do it as a video, but I didn't have anything prepared for you guys. And so, okay, and says great chat. Yeah, so I didn't really get it to prepare anything. And since as I had these worms and I needed to get them sorted out, since as they already mated, I didn't want them to stay too long. without me getting the experiment started, because then I didn't want it to affect the result that I would get. So okay, so let's see. I see Anne and I see CC on the chat. And for the rest, I don't know who you are, but thank you for joining the live. So I know Han has a worm farm and I know CC has a worm farm. Do the rest of you do worm farming? So there are a lot of things that are going to be changing regarding my channel for 2022. So I'm working on creating more informative videos. As you guys know, that my aim is always to produce videos that are going to be beneficial for my viewers. Of course, from time to time, I'm going to be having videos that are just for show and tell, as it were, not necessarily for educational purposes, but I'm going to be changing the focus of the channel to ensure that the videos, all of them, including the ones that are just show and tell, even if it is just one important tip that someone can benefit from, that my videos contain that. So you guys might notice that for the past 3 weeks, I have not been uploading as often as I used to. I'm thinking of also cutting down on doing videos every day, which is what I used to do. So I'm thinking of cutting down on the number of videos and spend more time focusing on making my videos more educational, because I think we need to spread the word about worm farming, and it has become a lot popular in the last few years. For example, when I bought my worms, that was in 2016, my first pound of worms, there was only one supplier in Saskatoon, and there was, well, two suppliers. One was, if you're a composter or you want to be a worm farmer, you could get a pound of worm or whatever amount of worms you want from her. And then there is the store that sell worms as pet food, so you could only buy them in small quantities. But in recent times, more and more worm farmers are coming on the market. They are just very small worm farmers, like someone have a few extra pounds of worms and they will sell it. So, and then the amount of calls that I get for worms is an indication that more people are becoming aware of worm farming. And I think we need to make as many people as possible know about worm farming, not just because we want to sell worms, but the benefits of worm farming is just, it's definitely worth having farmers being aware of it. For example, when you do worm farming, you are cutting back on the amount of material that gets taken to the landfill. And I think that is a big plus, because I don't know, when I drive past the landfill in Saskatoon, it's just mountains of garbage. So if I can do my part in reducing the amount of mess that is there, the amount of mountains that they're constantly creating to manage these garbage, and if I can help others in my neighborhood to do the same, then I think it is definitely worth it. But in addition to that, when you have your own worm farm, you can produce your own castings without having to go to the stores to purchase it. And trust me, worm castings can get pretty expensive depending on how much you need and depending on who the supplier is. And then most of the time, for people who buy worm castings, and if it is not the case where they are ordering from someone who produces the worm casting but they're buying it from a store, then they will get the casting that has dried out and doesn't have the microbes in it and stuff like that. So for that reason, I think it is a good idea to have your own worm farm, but then there are those who do not like worms, but they would like the benefit of worm farming. So for those ones, they don't have to raise the worm, but it is a good idea for them to be familiar with worm farming and the worm casting, because then they can find where they can get a supplier to supply them with the worm castings. Because when you use worm castings in your garden, the difference is very noticeable. The amount of nutrients that your plants get from it, the benefits of pest repelling properties in the worm casting, the benefit of the amount of microbes that it produces. And if you are the person who is raising your worms for your own garden, then there is something about worm farming that is quite relaxing. It is something similar to what you get from gardening, except that, well, I don't think there's an exception, because plants are alive too and the worms are alive, but there is just something about worm farming that is quite relaxing. So that is an additional benefit. So we need to spread the word about worm farming, because the more people know about it, the less we are going to need to use artificial fertilizers and things like that. Because when we use artificial fertilizers, the food just don't taste the same. So we need to find ways to use natural fertilizers. And if you can produce your own, then it can become a lot cheaper. And who wouldn't want to go for that, right? You can have it when you want it all the time. Yes, and then in addition to using the artificial fertilizer and the fact that the food just doesn't taste the same, sometimes we find that when you use artificial fertilizer, the food, the vegetables and the fruits, they tend to spoil faster than when you use organic means of fertilizing your plant. Some countries recognize worm castings as a fertilizer. Some countries recognize it as a supplement. So in Canada, it is not recognized as a fertilizer, but as a supplement. But they both serve the same purpose, whether it is fertilizer or supplement, it serves the same purpose. And then in addition to that, when you use artificial fertilizer, over the years that you're using the fertilizer, you will find that with time you're going to need to change the type of fertilizer that you're using, or you'll find that your soil is becoming more and more, having more difficulty to produce the food that you want it to produce. In fact, in Saskatchewan, those who have been using artificial fertilizers for a long time, they're finding that the land is just not producing the way it used to. So they constantly have to be trying to find new ways. And a lot of these fertilizers contain some amount of salt, and that salt buildup in the soil is what is preventing the plants from being able to absorb the nutrients from the soil, which is why the plants are not producing the way they are supposed to. So if they could find a way to give the soil some rest from those artificial fertilizers, or to stop using it, then that would be awesome. And then I was doing a research on worm farmers in Saskatchewan and looking at fertilizers. And then I came across a report that is saying that since the pandemic and with the drought that we had in 2021, farmers were really struggling. But then now they have to deal with the price of fertilizer that has drastically gone up. So they're going to have to find some way to manage the price or the rate that fertilizer is being sold at. So that is another challenge. So if we can find a way to increase the awareness of worm castings, then chances are even these farmers may have an alternative to using artificial fertilizers. Of course, the artificial fertilizers tend to have one small advantage or big advantage, depending on how you look at it, over worm castings, and that is because worm castings have so much nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus in it. It has enough to take care of your plants, but then there are some plants that are heavy nitrogen feeders or heavy phosphorus, or plants that loves a lot of potassium. So for those heavy nitrogen feeders, then they might have to use more worm casting in order to get the amount of nitrogen that the plant needs. The advantage, though, is that they are not using artificial chemicals at the same time. No matter how much worm castings you use, it won't affect the plants negatively. So it won't burn the plants, it won't cause any negative reaction to your plants. In fact, when you use artificial fertilizers, it is hardening your soil. It, over a period of time, it prevents the soil from the plants from being able to absorb the nutrients. Whereas when you use worm castings, it is amending your soil. It is adding the nutrients that your plants need. It is also helping your plants to retain, or the soil to retain, the moisture. But not only is it helping the soil to retain the moisture, it is also helping to prevent soil erosion. So whichever way you want to look at it, having people being aware of worm casting is beneficial, not just for the person who is using it, but for the environment as a whole. So it is good to try to find a way to spread the word out there about worm castings and the vast benefits that you can get from it. And one of the things that I appreciate about worm casting is that you don't really have to use a bulk of it to get the nutrients from for your plants, because worm casting does not just release its nutrients all at once, as is the case with a lot of fertilizers, where they just release the nutrients all at once. The worm castings will slowly release its nutrients. In fact, when you add worm castings to your soil, whether it is container or it is raised bed or it is just planting in the ground, when you had worm castings, it takes 2 months for the worm castings to fully release its nutrients. So over that period of time, the plant is constantly feeding on the nutrients that the worm casting has. So that is one of the benefits of using worm castings. And then I like the fact that you can use it in your seedling mix, because it helps with germination and it helps to hold moisture, so you don't have to water as frequently when you use worm castings in your seedling mix, and you don't have to use a lot in your seedling mix either. So that is the other good thing about it. And then when you are watering your seedlings, if you're not watering from the bottom, then you can use the worm castings to make worm tea and top water, or you can use the worm tea to bottom water your plants also. The what I like about the worm tea, if you're going to be top watering, is in addition to adding the fertilizer or the nutrients from the worm tea to the plants, it won't you don't have a buildup of material in your trays. So when you had other type of fertilizers, you might have a buildup. If you're adding compost and stuff like that, then you might end up with a buildup of material in your trays, and the trays can't hold anymore. But when you're using the worm tea, all it is just liquid that will be absorbed by the plants. And then if you have plants that are ailing, you can just make your worm tea and use it to water your plants, and then the nutrients is just readily available because worm castings is water soluble. So it makes it easy for the plants to absorb the nutrients as quickly as it can so that the plants can get a fighting chance to survive. So those are the reasons why I really, really like worm castings. In fact, I couldn't even see myself without worm castings since I started worm farming 6 years ago. It's just, and since then I haven't used any other form of fertilizer. I don't use artificial fertilizer. I've never used ever, not even once in my lifetime, use artificial fertilizer. I'm a strong believer in compost and hi Chanel, nice forehead. Yes, I like my forehead. Silly child. Yeah, so I'm a strong believer in compost, which is how I end up stumbling upon vermicomposting. And when I look at how my grandfather, hi Peggy, how are you? Let's see, you are a powerhouse of knowledge, my dear. Well done. Okay, thank you, my dear. I'm trying to be, still trying to gain more knowledge about the worm castings and raising worms and all of that, because I think there is just so much that we need to know. Yes, so when I was growing up and I would hear them people in the neighborhood talk about my grandfather's farm, and they would talk about how big his produce were and how pretty and luscious his garden, his farm was, and even the taste of it they would talk about. And he didn't use artificial fertilizer. He didn't compost. He compost in place. So whenever he harvests anything from his farm, then he would just put the plants back into the soil, and that's as far as it goes for him. And his produce were the talk of the town. So because of that, I grew up having this trust in compost. Yeah, so I've never really used artificial fertilizer. And now that I have discovered worm farming, there is no need for me to ever use artificial fertilizers. And despite the fact that I love being a part of teamworms, yes, definitely, definitely. Despite the fact that they can control the amount of potassium, nitrogen, and phosphorus in their artificial fertilizers, with all of that, and compare that to me using my worm castings, I've never really seen where my plants are lacking anything. Of course, casting varies. The quality of castings vary from person to person or from worm farm to worm farm because it depends on what you are feeding your worms. For example, you might be feeding your worms compost, or you might be feeding your worms worm chow, or you might be feeding your worm food scraps. Let's see. Your grandfather sounded like he was in permaculture before that term became popular. Okay, yeah. Yes, some people may use animal manure, and when you compare all these worms using these different types, you will find that some worms are fatter than others. Of course, there are other factors that determine whether or not your worms are fat or skinny, but the quality of your compost depend on what your worms are being fed. The most important thing about worm farming is not so much what you feed your worms. You must make sure that they have a very good supply of, Her Healthy Home says, fat or skinny. Is one better? Well, a fat worm is a happy worm, right? Yes, you want your worms to be big and luscious, especially if you're going to be selling them. But then if your worms are wishy-washy, it could be a sign that they are just not getting enough. Because, for example, the experiment that I just concluded with the cocoa coir versus dried leaves bedding, the worms that were in those bins, I started that experiment 2 months ago, a little bit over 2 months ago, and I have breeder bins that I just started. Skinny as in malnourished makes sense. Okay. Yes, I have breeder bins that I just started 3 weeks ago, and what I was feeding them was different. And the bin that I just started 3 weeks ago, the worms were twice and even sometimes more than twice the size of the worms that were in the experiment that started 2 months ago. And the difference is, though, those that were a part of the experiment, all they had was food scraps, and I didn't give them a lot of food scraps, just enough to keep them going. And then they had the cocoa coir as bedding, and then the other bin had dried leaves and the food scraps as bedding. They were not as fat as the worms that I had in the breeder bin. The breeder bin is cocoa coir, compost, and cornmeal, and those worms were a lot fatter than the ones that I've had for 2 months. So what you feed your worms do make a difference. And I don't think it is the case that the worms were malnourished while they were skinny, because they had food. Everything that you put into a worm bin is food, whether it is bedding or it is food scraps or it is animal dung. It is all food. So it's not that the worms are malnourished, it's just that they are skinny. And the smaller your worms are, the smaller the cocoons are going to be. And some say that smaller cocoons do not produce a lot of hatchlings, whereas larger cocoons produce more hatchlings. Whether or not that has been scientifically proven, I do not know, but some say it doesn't go like that. Some say that's how it is. So they're undecided where that is concerned. But then and again, you still want to have your worms looking all nice and round. Yeah, so as I was saying, the most important thing about raising worms is not so much what they are fed. Yes, certain types of worms are larger, Khadija. For example, the night crawlers are naturally larger than the red wrigglers, and they're larger than the blue worms. The night crawlers, the Canadian night crawlers, or dew worms as they're called, these are the largest of the night crawlers. That's why they're called the granddaddies of night crawlers. And then the European night crawlers and the African night crawlers, these are pretty big too, but they don't grow to the size of the Canadian night crawlers. Yes, so as I was saying, the important thing when it comes to worm farming is that you have to ensure that your worms have enough bedding. It doesn't matter what you're using as bedding, as long as it is a rich carbon source, then you have to make sure that your worms have enough bedding and that they have some other food source, some other form of greens to eat. So, like when you do your compost and you have your browns, which is the carbon-based material, and then you have your greens, which are your nitrogen-based foods. So you have to make sure that the worms have a lot of the carbon. In fact, they need more carbon than they need the nitrogen food, but you need to have a good balance of them. So if you don't have a good amount of bedding, you will find that your worms, even if they're doing good, they could do a lot better if they have bedding in the mix. For example, last year, no, in 2020, the only thing I fed my worm was compost. Apart from those that I had outdoors in my compost bin, the only thing I fed my worms that were in the garage was finished compost, not just compost, but finished compost. And those worms They didn't grow as big as my worms that are being fed compost now, but the compost is mixed in with other form of carbon. So I have shredded papers and shredded cardboard and dried leaves into the mix, and I can see a drastic difference in terms of size than when I was feeding them just compost. So what you feed your worms do make a difference. One other thing that you need to keep in mind when you are raising worms, if you want your castings to have the same quality all the time, then it is very important for you to ensure that it is the same type of food you are feeding your worms all the time. Because when you do that, you're going to ensure that the casting is the same quality all the time. And if you are someone who sells castings or you're contemplating to sell your castings, then you want to make sure that it is consistent. So if you are thinking of selling your castings, one of the things that I would recommend is that you try to figure out the source where you're going to get the food from that you're going to be feeding your worms. Make sure that it is somewhere where you can have a steady supply of it. That way you won't have to be feeding your worms something different when you run out of material. Yeah, so those are things that you keep in mind when you are running your worm farm. Now, if you're just worm farming for personal use, oh, hi, mom. If you are feeding, if you are raising worms just for personal use, then it may or may not matter to you whether or not the quality of your castings is consistent. But whether or not it is for personal use or not, then have you ever talked about how you got into worm farming? Yes, I have talked about how I got into worm farming. In fact, a few of my videos that I did recently touched on how I got into worm farming. Because 6 years ago, when I was composting, and you know that I live in Saskatchewan where temperatures can get as low as to the close to -40, and with wind chill it can be in the -50s. So it takes a whole year for me to have enough compost to use in my garden. So I wanted to find a way to increase the rate at which I was getting compost. And I find it so fascinating that you can talk about worms for hours. Yeah, so I wanted to find a way to increase the rate at which I was producing the compost, because when I was hot composting, it took a whole year for me to produce compost because our growing season. Yes, I remember that series. I saw that video. Okay. Yes, it took, we only have 3 to 4 months of growing season here. So if you cannot produce compost within that period of time, all of the rest of time is cold, so it doesn't really help you much. So that is how I started researching how to speed up the composting process, and stumbled upon vermicomposting. So that is how I got my start. I started looking around Saskatoon to see if I can find anyone who sells composting worms. Thankfully, there was one lady who supplied them, so I was quite happy. And now I can't even see myself without them. My husband said that the worms are my first love, and now he's in second place. I was talking to one of my friends this morning. She's in BC, and she said, Marsha, do you realize that you're always talking about your worms? Yes, I'm always talking about my worms. But then she's saying that, and she's the one who asked me about my worms. But everyone always, I guess once they know that I worm farm, they're always asking me how are my little worms doing. Because a lot of people, when they go on social media to blog, they blog about their work, they blog about their activity at home, their kids and stuff like that. But once I go on any form of social media, 99% of the time, it is always something about worms. So when anyone calls me, it's always worms that they're talking about. They don't call without mentioning my worms. But yes, worms, raising worms, or at least having access to worm castings is definitely worth it. Let's see. So it can be tricky. Let's see. I would like to try it, but whenever my husband finds a work, he wants to feed it to the chicken. I would be devastated. You know what? If you can keep it away from him for maybe a year, you can actually start producing enough worms that you can actually use it to feed your chicken and still have enough worms to provide your garden with the nutrients that it needs. Yeah, so you can actually, so you know how I'm raising my worms and I'm using it for my garden and then I'm using it for commercial purposes. Marky, you don't have to go that big in terms of the amount of bins and all of that, but you can have a few bins going and then you'll have so enough where you can feed your chickens and take care of your garden. In fact, there are quite a few organizations now that are looking into raising worms or using worms as food protein source for animals. So they're trying to find ways to see how they can raise the worms to be the fattest that they can be, grow the fastest that they can grow. So they're researching pretty much everything they can about the worms now to see how best they can go about raising these worms to turn it into a good protein source for all sorts of animals. I was very surprised when I saw that. I do know that people use them to feed pets and that they use it for baits, but I didn't know that they were actually contemplating using them as a protein source for animal feed. But it would be interesting to see what the final result is on that. Will the worms produce enough protein, or do they have enough protein for them to use it as animal feed? And if so, are they planning to feed it live to the animals? Not all animals will go for that. Or are they planning to make them into a feed? It will be interesting to see what they do with that research. But yes, definitely worm farming is worth it any way you look at it. And then if you're a worm farmer, it gives your kids, depending on what age they are, because the older ones tend not to be so intrigued in most cases, but younger ones are intrigued. And then when you help these young ones to see the worms growing and see the benefit of the worm farm or the worm castings in your garden, then you are setting them up to become worm farmers when they grow up and have their garden. So less chances of them using artificial chemicals in their garden. So there's just so many different benefits to worm farming. Yes, but as I was saying, yes, you can raise them and have them to feed your chickens and still take care of your garden. I still, I've been raising worms for 6 years now, and I've never ever used even one of my worms for fishing. And I fish every year, so I don't know how it is that I haven't used any of my worms for fishing yet. Well, I guess I'm going to have to get on it. I'd like to see how the worms perform when you use them as bait. Canadian night crawlers, those I would definitely grow for fishing. I attempted to grow them several times, but it's not working out with the Canadian night crawlers because they require too much care, and the environment that they require to live in, I cannot provide it for them. Only if it is winter, then I can, but in the summer, the care that they require is just more than I can manage. But these are the ideal worms for fishing in my region because it gets the water here. I see people swimming in it, and I'm wondering if maybe there is something wrong with their upstairs, because when you put your foot in the water, even on the hottest day in summer, your foot is cramped. That's how cold it is. And I see some people swimming in the water here. So for that reason, and because the Canadian like night crawlers love the cool temperature, they are the ideal worms for fishing. And then because of their size, that to make them ideal for fishing. The African night crawlers definitely would not work for fishing because they don't like cold and we don't have warm water here. And then the European night crawlers, I don't know if anyone ever tried using them for fishing in this region, but I guess they don't mind some amount of cool temperature, because I know that Anne raised hers in England, and where she's raising them, they're outdoors even in the winter, and it can get pretty cold there. So I think maybe the European night crawlers would do well here as a fishing worm, but I've never really tried them nor the red wigglers. So maybe I should do that this year, see how they perform. Are they going to live long in the water? Are they going to die quickly? What are the worms? Are the fish going to go for them? But I guess if I'm going to be raising worms for fishing purposes, I would consider raising them by themselves and raise them differently from how I raise these, because I'd want them to be as fat as they possibly can be. That's how I'd want all my worms to be. But in general, when I'm raising my worms, I don't really separate the adults from the young ones. And when you want to fatten your worms, it's a good, if the larger you want your worms to be, then you might want to keep the adults to themselves, because when you have a mixed bin, then the worms don't really grow to their full potential. They'll grow big, but they won't really grow to their full potential. So if I was to raise them for fishing purposes, then I'd have to get some extra bins, or at least convert some of the bins that I have now into fishing worm bins. Maybe I should do that, and then with one little bin, fatten up some and try them for the fishing season. Still have ways to go, so I have enough time to fatten them up. Our fishing season don't start until the first week in May. We don't ice fish. We've tried several times, but it didn't really work out. We go ice fishing and you spend the whole day and you catch maybe one fish. Funny enough, when my husband goes out with friends who has been ice fishing for years, they tend to catch a lot of fish. But when my husband and when the family goes out, even if we go in the same spot where he goes with his friends, it's always one fish. And sometimes the fish is so small, we just put them back into the water. So I don't know what it is that we are not doing right. But so we don't go ice fishing. And then it's so cold. If we had one of those little cabins or huts that they put on the ice and go into, then maybe that would make a difference. But yeah, we don't ice fish, unfortunately. Someday, maybe in the future. Anyway, it is quickly approaching the time for my daughter to get back in here and do her schoolwork. So in a little bit, I am going to be saying goodbye to you guys. So, Khadijah, if your husband is going to be using your worms to feed his chickens, another thing that you can do then is get the worms and throw them into your garden. That way you'd have the benefit of the worms, and you won't be able to give them to your chicken unless he's going to have to dig up your garden to find the worms. The only disadvantage of having, depending on the type of worms that you have in your garden, the regular earthworms, if you can put organic matter to your garden and attract them, then that is awesome, because they do well whether it is hot or cold season, they will survive. The night crawlers will survive too, not the African night crawlers. If you're in areas that have freezing temperature, then the African night crawlers will not survive, neither will their cocoons. But if you have other type of night crawlers, Canadian or European night crawlers, they will survive. The only disadvantage to having them in your garden is that they are burrowing worms, and so they tend to take the food down, eat, and they go down deep into the soil and poop. So sometimes your plant don't really have access to their castings because of how deep they may go, but sometimes they will still drop their litter close to the surface. But you have them there aerating the soil, you have them there breaking down the compost, so it still is beneficial to have them in your garden, but you just won't get the same benefit as if you have them in a worm bin, because then you get to distribute the castings in the top soil that you want it to be in. Red wigglers too will survive the winter. These ones are will not survive the winter. These are top feeders, so they don't burrow down. So when these ones drop their castings, then the castings is readily available to your garden. So the unfortunate thing is that they don't survive the winter. But on the plus side, their cocoons do survive the winter. So every year you will have them coming back and rebuilding their population because of those cocoons. So if you're going to be putting them in your garden and you want the best result, then I would say do either the red wigglers, or you do a combination of the red wigglers and the night crawlers that can withstand the cool temperature. Because when you do a combination, you're getting the castings from the red wigglers and a little from the night crawlers, but then the night crawlers will aerate your soil. Red wigglers do not aerate your soil. Yes, because as I said before, they're not burrowing worms. They will just stay in the region where you have a lot of organic matter. So if your soil is fairly loose and you have a lot of organic matter, even if it is 12 inches of loose soil with a lot of organic matter, your red wigglers will be in that 12 inches of loose soil as long as it has enough organic matter. Yeah, so you can just add them to your garden and then that will take care of that problem. Anyway, guys, thank you for your participation in the live. So if you guys want to see the update on the experiment that we were doing with the worms, where we have one worm in each of the two bins, and we're going to be watching after they've mated. So I caught them while they were mating, and one worm in each of the bins. So we're going to see how many cocoons we're going to be getting. Can you go back, please? I'll be with you shortly. I'm almost finished.
I was gonna say that I'm hungry.
You're always hungry, dear. That's why I told you I'll be with you shortly, okay? Behave yourself and go. I'll be with you in a few minutes.
That's why I was trying to get out the door.
Okay, see ya. Oh my goodness, that child's eat like a horse. Always eating. Yes, so we're going to see how many cocoons are going to be produced from just that one mating, and then we're going to see how long those worms are going to live, and we're going to see how well they do on their own, because it's only one worm per bin. And then we have the other bin with the two worms, so we're going to be comparing the ones with the single worms with the ones that have the two worms in it to see in terms of size, because the bins are the same size and the content of the bin is the same material and the same volume. So we're going to see if it makes a difference having two worms in the one bin compared to having one worm in the bin. We're going to see if size-wise it makes a difference. So thank you for your participation, and I hope to see you again. So if you want to see an update on these experiment, then you are gonna have to watch my videos. I may do it in a live after I figured out how to set up my webcam. But you can follow along with my videos to see the update on that. So thank you for your participation and stay safe. I hope to see you guys again on Monday. Oh, that would be healthier, but surprisingly, I don't like the idea of growing something just to feed it to another animals. Okay. I know it's natural, but I feel bad. Okay, I can see you feeding one of your babies to chicken. Oh my goodness, why wasn't this thing scrolling? I missed out on so many comments. Let's see. What happened to your worms in the refrigerator? Oh, hiding worms. Great visit this week. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Happy vermicomposing. Because they don't aerate the soil. Oh, earthworms do aerate the soil, but they're not good in the worm bin because they are not used to confinement. They don't do well in confinement. Worms mating, I'm sure that's a sight. You are still live. Okay. All right. So thank you for that and take care.